I'm Dr. Devra Davis, the president and founder of Environmental Health Trust, and I'm here with you today with two very distinguished guests who are going to speak with us about some of the important questions that remain in how we address the problems of 5G. As many of you are aware, 5G is a work in progress. In order for it to work effectively, it will be refarming signals that are currently used at 3G and 4G. And that means basically that antennae are going to be brought closer to human beings than ever before, because in order to work effectively, the 5G network will have to take all of the existing devices and allow them to talk to one another through the new antenna system. And effectively, this means that signals that have previously been reserved chiefly to the tops of buildings and mountaintops in many countries and some cities around the world are allowed to be placed 8 feet above the height of people and right on the wall or right next to their homes. If you want more information about that, you can find that on our website at ehtrust.org. We'll begin with Professor John William Frank. He's a physician who holds the chair in the Department of Public Health Research and Policy at the University of Edinburgh, and is one of the world's leading scientists studying the social and non-scientific determinants influencing public health policy. He will tell us a little bit more about his previous work, but we are going to focus today on a recent publication in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health, where Professor Frank talked about the fact that despite the claims of various committees that there's no proof of harm, including 2 recent publications from Australia, the science most certainly indicates that the need for a cautious approach when it comes to 5G. And he has joined with several hundred other expert scientists, including myself and Professor Miller, in calling for a moratorium on the 5G network until we have better information on its potential public health impact. Professor Frank is formerly a fellow with the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research in Population Health, and also served as a professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Public Health Sciences, now the Dalai Lama School of Public Health. He is a provostial advisor on population health at the University of Toronto. He held that position there previously, and also, as I was, an adjunct professor at the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley, where he received the Distinguished Teacher and Mentor of the Year Award. And without further ado, I will then introduce one of his most distinguished mentors, and actually a man who first introduced him to epidemiology, Professor Anthony Miller. Professor Miller has been a senior medical advisor to Environmental Health Trust for some time now, and we are delighted to work with him on a number of important projects. He himself has authored several hundred publications on environmental health and cancer, including reports published in the peer-reviewed literature concluding that wireless radiation is a cause of cancer in human beings. Dr. Miller, also a physician, was the director of the epidemiology unit at the National Cancer Institute of Canada. He's been a distinguished advisor to the National Cancer Institute in the United States, as well as to the World Health Organization, International Agency for Research on Cancer, where he played an important role in reviewing their report in 2011 on the possible causes that wireless radiation could have for cancer in humans. In 2011, as some of you know, the International Agency for Research on Cancer concluded that wireless radiation should be thought of as a possible cause of cancer in humans. And more recently, Professor Miller and I and other experts who have advised the World Health Organization concluded that were a committee of the International Agency for Research on Cancer to review all of the data available now, they would conclude that the evidence clearly establishes that wireless radiation is a cause of human cancer. And now I return to Professor Frank because his important article on 5G has really been a wake-up call for those who previously were not aware of the issue. Professor Frank, would you please take a few moments and walk us through how you decided to write this article and what your basic conclusions have been.
Thank you, Devra. It's a great privilege to be with you today, and particularly to be here with the man who taught me epidemiology 4 decades ago in the University of Toronto. So nice to see you, Tony. So I am not by trade an environmental epidemiologist. I'm a very peripatetic, that is, wide-ranging epidemiologist, and I probably studied 100 different diseases in my 40 years. But it's only recently that I became aware of the controversy around electromagnetic fields, and particularly the uncertainties associated with 5G and the machinery that goes with it, that supports it. And so about 2 years ago, when a community activist, not in environmental issues, but actually in children's health and well-being and education, said to me, "Are you familiar with this?" I said, "No." So I asked the top public health officials on the scientific side in Scotland, very well-trained people. None of them had ever heard of it. And I began to realize that the public health community in Britain, at least, was completely insulated from this set of issues. And I decided I needed to write something more for them, or more for the scientific and professional community in public health than for the public. So in beginning to read around this, it doesn't take very long before one gets the distinct impression something's not quite right. And I put 4 major points forward in my article, and I'll just succinctly describe them. The first is that when you try to find literature on 5G, never mind the health effects, it's too soon for the kind of studies that I and Professor Miller know about, which is epidemiological. It's too soon for them to have been able to report. But when you look for studies on 5G, you quickly realize that no one has defined precisely what the technology is, and that there are many, many kinds of technology within it, most of which are patented, proprietary. And so actually researchers who want to study these things are not entirely able to access details of the technology to replicate it, even in a laboratory study. So that I thought was rather striking, considering that this is being rolled out, as you said, Devra, worldwide at a very high density. And then you go a little farther and you find that the animal and laboratory studies in general, both in vivo, as we see in animals, and in vitro in glassware, literally, have only started to converge more recently in suggesting a wide range of biological effects, ranging from the molecular through the subcellular and cellular up to the tissue level, in a range of species, very wide range of species, not just humans. And that those effects are not dependent on the old-fashioned thinking, which still dominates the main advisory committee to the WHO that you mentioned. That thinking was that only by the heating up of living tissue are these health effects of electromagnetic fields caused. And we now know there's no question that there's a huge plethora of effects across the levels that I indicated in living creatures, and that many of them would be expected to have health consequences in terms of disease, increased disease frequency. Some of them in the shorter run, for example, pregnancy complications, miscarriages, and so forth. And many of them in the longer run, such as cancers, which Professor Miller has spent his life studying. It takes often decades before cancers appear in a human being or in an animal after, well, certainly in a human being after exposure to a carcinogenic substance, or in this case, form of radiation. So that means that there is a mechanism, a set of biologically plausible mechanisms, as we say in our business, in epidemiology. And that's a criterion for causation, but it's not the main criterion. So let's just quickly then say, what can we say about the human epidemiological evidence in living communities of human beings? And that is where Professor Miller and yourself in a recent article in Frontiers in Public Health, I think, began to turn the tide towards thinking, for many of us, that the evidence is now convergent and suggests causation, that we we had a lot of doubters before. Many people pointed to negative studies of, say, earlier generations of cell phones and their radiation, 2G, 3G. Those forms of cell phone radiation were dominant in the 1990s and 2000s. And it's only now that we've reached the point where you'd expect to see cancers clearly linked to those exposures. And those studies are now appearing. And they were well reviewed in your paper. And I've just seen a report sent to me today by Christopher Pari, who is a former environmental protection agency scientist in the United States. And he's done an exhaustive review of all of the studies, both in animal studies, but also human epidemiological studies, linking two tumors of the brain and the inner ear to cell phone radiation from that earlier era. So in other words, there's a recently convergent body of evidence to worry about, that the earlier forms of these electromagnetic fields were not benign. So that would mean that under the 5G rollout plans, where there will be literally transmitters every few hundred meters, as you said, throughout residential areas, in order to deal with the fact that these high frequency waves are interrupted by foliage and even fog, all kinds of things. So you need to put the transmitters, the boosters, very, very frequently in space. And I think most of us would expect that to mean a higher level of population exposure. So for me, the final clincher that convinced me that something was really not quite right here was that Leonard Hartel of Sweden and others have documented improprieties in the operations of the key international advisory committees, such as the one to the WHO that I mentioned. And by that, I mean unmanaged conflicts of interest. It seems very clear that significant numbers of members of these committees, he documents for a half a dozen of them, linkages, very strong linkages to the telecommunications industry, and some fairly strong evidence that decisions made by those advisory committees have been influenced by the vested interests of that industry, including the stubborn reluctance of the WHO advisory structure to consider non-heating effects of these forms of radiation. So I'll conclude with that, just to say, as they say, you smell something a bit rotten in Denmark. On one occasion, it could just be someone serving cheese. On two occasions, maybe there's a cheese exhibition in town. On 3 occasions, maybe there's a cheese factory in town. But after 4, which I found, there's something rotten in Denmark.
Well, unfortunately, well said. I thank you for that overview. I think it's important for people to understand a little bit more about epidemiology. That is to say, what we do. And I think that let me take a moment as someone who is trained in both toxicology and epidemiology to clarify something. We do experiments on animals in order to predict effects in humans. That's how all the drugs, all the vaccines, the things that we develop, that's how they are first started. We study them in animals. Now, in this particular instance, as we are all aware, when animal research shows that there's a problem, then the argument of industry is, well, people aren't really animals. We have to study people. There's only one basic problem. When we study animals, we're predicting effects. We are trying to predict the future. When we study people, we are actually telling you about the past. And that means that if you commit to requiring human evidence of harm, you are effectively condemning people to be part of an experiment, and in this case, without controls. Because if the 5G system is to be implemented as currently planned, there will be no control group anymore. And I'd like to ask Professor Miller, our distinguished colleague and mentor to both of us, to just take a moment and explain what the tools of epidemiology in terms of prospective studies and case control studies, each of which is telling us about the past, but the limitations, particularly of prospective studies when you're studying a rare outcome such as brain cancer, and in fact, the challenge we face with respect to, say, a much more common problems such as reproductive failure. Just to elaborate for a moment, right now, there's a huge increase across the world in problems of infertility in men and women. There has been a steady decline in sperm count and measures of sperm quality, including mitochondrial DNA damage on sperm or ways of measuring sperm's ability to swim and their shape, called motility and morphology. There's been a documented increase and worsening of male reproductive health. Now, there are many factors that may account for this, including pesticides, the modern environment, frankly, tight underwear, many different factors. But one of the factors that has been clearly identified in experimental studies, again, with animals, some of which I've done with my colleagues in other countries, has been that exposure to wireless radiation at current non-thermal levels that Professor Frank just talked about, that those non-thermal levels of a phone in the pocket are clearly associated with sperm damage. And yet, when it comes to the tools of epidemiology, we are being incredibly forced to say, show us the bodies, show us the evidence. So Professor Miller, could you just take a moment, recognizing that we have many people on the call who may not really appreciate even the difference between toxicology and epidemiology. And you, as someone who chaired a committee at the National Academy of Sciences that reviewed all the evidence on environmental epidemiology at that time in 1990, that's how far back we go, you have certainly a lot of experience on the ground of dealing with these challenging issues. Would you kindly elaborate for us?
Well, Devra, what we have to understand is when we're studying humans, we are studying exposures that may have occurred recently or in the past. And in the present situation, we are dealing with a multitude of people who have been exposed to radiofrequency radiation, the radiation used to power cell phones, the radiation used in these 5G networks, which are coming into a place in various places. And that what then happens is you have to watch people with time. You don't get an instantaneous effect of the radiofrequency radiation on subsequent diseases such as cancer. You have to wait for time. Now, there are two types of epidemiology studies which have been used to evaluate the risks of radiofrequency radiation. One of them, which many people might feel was superior, are what we call cohort studies, in which we gather together information on a usually large group of people, identify those who have had exposure, follow them, and determine the diseases that occur in the future. But the problem with that sort of study in relation to an exposure such as radiofrequency radiation, which is increasing in time, is that the information you collected at the beginning of the study is probably not relevant to the diseases which occur later. So that although there have been two cohort studies that have looked at this issue, it is perhaps not surprising that the evidence derived from them is not very adequate. So what about the other type of study? These are what we call case control studies. Now, case control studies have to be done very well with a lot of care to avoid what we call biases, that is, other factors that might account for what you're seeing. The case control studies that have been largely done by a group of investigators led by Lennart Hardell in Sweden. And that's important because Sweden was one of the first countries to introduce cell phones powered by radiofrequency radiation. And what Hardell studies have shown is that with time, with increasing exposure, the risks of certain type of cancers, particularly brain cancer and cancer of the vestibular nerve, the nerve which goes from the ear to the brain, increase with time. And what is perhaps particularly worrying is that he and others have documented exposures which have occurred in children or teenagers, and already we're beginning to see some effects on them. If we're already seeing it now, the chances are we're going to see a great deal more in the future, because the effects of the exposures will not be taken away by continuing, certainly not by continuing exposure, but even by preventing the exposure, so that there is a substantial risk that what we have so far documented in Sweden and several other countries will be followed by increasing evidence, increasing incidence of brain and other cancers attributable to radiofrequency radiation. The parallel I would draw with this, for those who have some knowledge of epidemiology, is the time it took to establish that cigarette smoking resulted in substantial increase in lung and other cancers. And it took that time because you had to have people who studied this, who were followed, and who were carefully assessed in terms of the extent of their exposure. And in terms of the hazards of cigarette smoking, we were particularly fortunate that one of the premier epidemiologists of our time, Sir Richard Dahl, led a very important study on tobacco and smoking in British doctors, and followed them for over 20 years. Now,
yes, I want to mention something that I'm not sure either of you would be aware of. When I met with Sir Richard Dahl at IARC to discuss these, and they were developing the monograph on smoking and passive smoking, he told me something that I found shocking that I want to share with you. He told me that he had actually completed his work in 1950. And as you know, he didn't publish it till 1955. And when I asked why, he said, remember, in 1950, the British government was bankrupt, and revenues from tobacco taxes were an important revenue source for the government. And he was encouraged, shall we say, pressured not to publish his results because of that. Now that I found an astonishing fact, but not surprising. I mean, Britain at that time was eating horse meat for food. And it's hard for people to realize how much of an impact on Britain the war had had in terms of its economy. And I think that that's a sad reflection of the reality that we're facing here, because the telecom industry is one of the, if not the richest, most profitable, and frankly, most powerful in the world. The amount of funding in the United States Congress that goes to both Republicans and Democrats from the telecom industry is far greater than that of big pharma. So we're talking about the most influential force there is. Now, we're very fortunate that just last week, we had a discussion with some telecom insiders who had left their jobs marketing for telecom in Australia because they had become so disgusted with the failure of the companies to address the public health and environmental impacts. And they have started a campaign called We Are Not Sam, which focuses on the fact that the current standards for phones are based, as you all know, on a large empty bowling ball that is supposed to substitute for the human head, into which homogeneous fluid is poured and measures are made of how warm that fluid gets. When in fact, as Professor Miller and I have repeatedly noted, there are effects that have nothing to do with heat at all, but with the pulsation and the irregularity of the signals. And with 5G, we know that that will be worsened. Now, we have a few questions that have been submitted, and one I will give to Professor Miller. What about the increases in thyroid cancer and colorectal cancer? Could you tell us first what they are and whether you think they could plausibly be related to the increase in exposures to radiation, and in this case, in particular, to cell phones?
Well, we've known about the increases in thyroid cancer for some time. Now, the thyroid is an organ which is easily palpated, and if you get a tumor, it's easy to find. The possibility that thyroid cancer may be increased by people holding cell phones at their ear and that the radiation comes down and affects the thyroid has to be recognized. That is a possibility. But as yet, I'm not aware of any definitive study which has shown that. However, in terms of colorectal cancer, it may seem surprising that exposures which tend to occur up here should affect the colon. Yet, what people don't recognize is that cell phones continue to radiate, to continue to communicate, even when you're not using them. And most people put cell phones in their, at least most men, in their trouser pockets, and therefore the colon will be irradiated by radiofrequency radiation. And recently, we, that is you, I, Devra, and I think he was a student of yours, or published a paper which have pointed out the likelihood that some of the increase in colorectal cancer we've been seeing may be due to exposure to radiofrequency radiation from cell phones.
Indeed, in that paper, we showed a 4-fold increase in the youngest age group of young adults in rectal cancer. And it turns out, since we published that paper, in that paper, we talked about increases in the United States and Iran, which were quite shocking. And since then, subsequent publications have found the same pattern in the UK. And there's no explanation for why in one decade, in the past decade, there's been such a dramatic increase in this cancer. And unfortunately, because it's in young people in whom we never screen and we never expect to look for colorectal cancer, in many of these cases, the disease is detected at a very advanced stage, and many of them unfortunately do very poorly because of it. I want to also clarify something about thyroid cancer. A recent paper was produced by a group of investigators at Yale on thyroid cancer. And they did a case control study where, as you say, they compared people with thyroid cancer to those without the disease, but who were otherwise similar in age, demographics, et cetera. And they found, when looking for a particular single nucleotide excision repair called a SNP, a particular type of genetic characteristic, that they found that people that had this rather common SNP had 4-fold increased risk in thyroid cancer if they were regular users of cell phones. This is a very important new study, and that study adds further evidence to the argument that thyroid cancer with the phones, particularly the new phones, by the way, the new phones have antennas around the border, and many of them right at the issue if you hold a phone right here, which is why Environmental Health Trust has practical advice for why you should never hold a phone next to your head. You should use a speakerphone or a headset, and frankly, you should use your phones a lot less. Think of them as an answering machine, forward them to your landline, and try to get away from exposing yourself 24/7 to a form of radiation that can damage DNA, can cause cancer, and we think can cause a number of other things. Now, one of the questions we've been asked is, what prompted Dr. Frank to write this? Why, and I think you started to answer that question. What's happening on the ground in Scotland with respect to this issue? I know there are people very concerned about launching of rockets and what's going to be happening to some precious environments there. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, well, as I published the article and I began to receive communications from people I'd never met who were concerned about and active in investigating 5G and its rollout in the UK, they brought my attention to launch sites, which are already purchased by SpaceX and some other independent companies. These companies each propose to put between 40 and 50,000 low-flying orbiting satellites around the Earth. So these would be competing, flying between 200 and 300 miles up. And those satellites will use 5G frequencies to communicate with base stations. So in this situation, it's not so much that there'll be much residual energy left in signals from those satellites. It's rather that it enables this enormous number of base stations throughout the world, and that those base stations have to, as I said earlier, use very spatially frequent, high density local transmitters, amplifiers, if you like, of the signal, and that it's those that are going to be close to people. So I won't go through some of the concerns of the local environmentally oriented group that have discovered these plans, but let's just say that if you thought we have a problem with space junk now, this is not even in the same category. This is going to be a wall of satellites. And I think the part that's upsetting for those of us who are concerned is that the goal here includes lots and lots of consumer services that most of us don't want or need, such as driverless cars. Driverless cars, as you must know, have to be connected at all times with very frequent internet signals in order to avoid, obviously, accidents. Also, the Internet of Things, people who are fascinated by the possibility of using their cell phone to control every appliance in their house and their security system. I don't need it. I don't know why other people need it, but I think the really key thing here is that it sells products and services. That's the key. And I'm afraid that that is taken precedence, that driver, purely economic driver, has taken precedence over a broader consideration of the potential health and environmental issues.
Well, I thank you for that. In addition, there is a lawsuit that has just been filed against the launch of what you have described correctly, potentially 100,000 new satellites orbiting above the Earth. The opportunity for space junk is quite obvious. The opportunity for collisions is serious. And more importantly, the NASA, our space agency, and NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, are on record as objecting to 5G because they say it will interfere with celestial navigation, it will interfere with marine navigation, and it will interfere with and set weather prediction back 2 decades. Now, weather prediction, we see now the dreadful storms affecting flooding in Sydney, Australia, that overflowing of the major dam there. I thought we've all been to Sydney and we know how dreadful that is because of these torrential rains. And if we lose the ability to predict these extreme weather events, which are occurring more frequently, that will be tragic for public health as well. Because when you can predict a serious event, you can prepare for it, and disaster preparation is the only thing we can do when it comes to things like hurricanes and severe weather events. And when I was a member of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that did win the Nobel Prize as a team member in 2007, we were very concerned at that time about the need to create the infrastructure at a local level to prepare for and anticipate these kinds of disasters and have at hand the capacity to deal with them. And so we realize that this launching of these satellites is really very problematic, and it is an example of why we need a better coordination among nations. So we have a couple more questions I'd like to turn to now. One is, can the use of headphones, instead of putting the phone by the ear, diminish the danger of using a cell phone?
Well, if I may take a first stab at that, it depends very much on the type of material used in the headphones. There are some headphones that have been carefully designed to ensure that you don't get radiation coming up from the cell phone to the head. But some of them are not of that nature. In fact, some of them even depend on radio frequency. The buds, I forget what they're called. Devra knows.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. The developing brain of children, even children in their teen years, are not fully myelinated. Myelin, as you all know, is a fatty protective sheath that forms around neurons in the brain. And that process of myelination to protect these neurons is not complete until the mid to late 20s, often completed later in boys than girls, than we think may be associated with the higher rate of accidents among young men and death from accidents among young men, because myelination, among many other things, confers judgment and allows for a more sophisticated functioning of the brain. And what we know is that these children with these AirPods in their ears, their brains are not fully myelinated, and therefore the exposure that they're getting while they're still developing is much more critical. Now we have another question about when will the IARC publish an update of their evaluation of the carcinogenic dangers of electromagnetic fields? And I'm going to answer that question and invite you to hop on if you like. There's a new director of IARC who has a very stellar record in her work, Elizabeth Viderpas. She has a big and important job, starting with the fact that the United States, much to my dismay, defunded the World Health Organization briefly. That's in the process of being changed. So she was lacking funding to do anything. Moreover, this issue is one where there's tremendous pressure, even on the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So the prospects for an independent study by IARC in the near future are very, very dim right now. That was one of the reasons that led Professor Miller and me to develop the analysis that we did develop. Of course, we would like to see IARC be able to do this. In order to do this kind of work, they would need major funding. And the example of what happened to the National Toxicology Program is instructive. When the National Toxicology Program of the United States government, the gold standard for studying animals, first developed their study and decided they were going to study this problem, they were told to study it in 1999, ironically by the FDA. They did not properly start the study until almost a decade later. And we had an Environmental Health Trust hosted a major international meeting on this issue where the NTP, the National Toxicology Program, explained that there'd been some delays. Well, I can assure you the reason for the delays has to do with the Chinese proverb, if you don't want to know, you don't ask. So for a long time, there's been a lot of pressure not to ask the question. And that remains the situation. As I document in my book, Disconnect, the truth about cell phone radiation, this industry has explicitly adopted a strategy of war games on the science. That's what Professor Frank was alluding to before. That's what Professor Miller and I have experienced as well. And for that reason, I think it's extremely unlikely that in the near term, we will see an independent evaluation of this issue by the World Health Organization. Now we have another question that comes up. Are the 3G and 4G radiation also dangerous, or is it just 5G we have to be worried about? And obviously, I think there's a lot of confusion about what that means. Professor Frank, would you like to take a first stab at that?
Well, I think Professor Miller explained very clearly that it takes a few decades often before effects like cancers become evident after people begin to be exposed to something new. So 2G, 1990s, 3G, a little bit later, 4G, the last decade, you can see for yourself that the cancers, at least as one major health effect, if they're there, would not be apparent from the latest generation, 4G, and they'd only beginning to be apparent from 3G, and we might be lucky and see them if they are there from 2G because a few decades have elapsed since those were widely used for the first time by whole populations of human beings. So the truth of the matter is, therefore, that the more recent the technology, particularly for cancers, but there are other delayed health effects, the less we know. But the direction of our ignorance is always consistent. It's always in the false negative direction, meaning we're falsely reassured by the fact that there's no evidence, because the truth is you wouldn't expect to see any tumors yet. So this means that we can't say very much about the more recent generations. We can say nothing at all about 5G. There are no studies, human epidemiological studies in free living populations of 5G's health effects, because it's just being rolled out and it takes years to set these studies up. So I think the answer to the question is, the longer the exposure's been around, for these exposures, the more and more evidence has accumulated that there's a problem, particularly for delayed effects like cancers. But maybe, Tony, you'd like to add to that.
Well, I don't actually, because you described that very well. I absolutely agree with what you've said. We unfortunately are not sure yet whether we've had any human evidence that 4G increases the risk of cancer. It would be startling if it didn't. What we have to go on in relation to 5G at the moment is the fact that we know it damages plants around it. We know that it has biological effects. It affects insects, so that if it affects them, likelihood is very strong that it'll affect humans. So
I'm sorry, may I add something here? I think I would say that there's no question that 3G is dangerous, because that has in fact been studied experimentally. And I want to go back to my opening remarks. When we study animals, we study them to predict effects in humans. We are now experimenting on people, particularly with respect to those who have electromagnetic illness. There are growing numbers of people who have electromagnetic illness. They are more sensitive to this radiation than most of us. We have no idea what the number is. It could be, in some populations, it's been estimated to be as high as 10%. It could be more. I think we all respond to electromagnetic radiation. Some people feel it, most right now do not. And I think that we are all cancer epidemiologists by training. I am as well from my training at Hopkins. But cancer, with all due respect, is the wrong question here. It is the wrong question. As Professor Frank just said, we need to wait a long time for cancer to develop in the human population. So that's why we study animals. We take animals, and in their short 2-year rodent lifetime, we give animals as much exposure as humans get in their 70+ years of life. And that is the model that has been established for pharmacology for more than half a century. Established models for studying animals. Now, with respect to cancer in animals, here's what we know. Every agent that we know for certain will produce cancer in people does produce it in animals when adequately studied. We are ignoring that at our peril, because not only do we have the National Toxicology Program study, a $30 million state-of-the-art study that finally got released after enormous pressure was put on it. We have studies that had been done prior to that, looking at brains of animals, showing DNA damage in animals in 1994 by Henry Lai and Vijay Singh. And that brilliant study was challenged by industry through a series of war games. And yet their findings have been corroborated over and over again, including by the multi-million-dollar European Union-funded REFLEX project headed by Franz Edelkofer and others, which recently won a lawsuit against charges that had been made that the study was fraudulent. And charging the study with fraud for a scientist is like accusing them of rape, because once you're accused of fraud, you really have the accusation itself becomes an impossible thing to deal with. In this case, they were charged with scientific fraud, and because Edelkofer persisted in the courts over many years, they were able to say the charge itself was wrong, and to say that the literature shows that there is clearly evidence of DNA damage, and that evidence has been around now for several decades. Now, a question that we've received is, how come the Otard regulation is being approved? We have to say, what is Otard? Otard is a regulation by the FCC that would allow the location of antennas anywhere that the companies want to place them. And because, as Professor Frank has indicated, for the 5G network to work, antennas will have to be located in the United States about every 150 feet. 150 feet. That's because the 5G signal, although it's very fast, does not go very far. So it's like making a 12-lane highway that can go about half a mile. That's what it is. And so what you need is you need the antennas located in great proximity to one another. This will effectively blanket the environments with this combined radiation of 3G and 4G to connect all the devices we currently own, plus the new 5G signals, which will work when you buy your new 5G phone and your new 5G router and your new 5G computer and your new 5G washing machine and coffee pot and whatever other gizmo you want to have. So as a consequence, this is a huge marketing play, brilliant from a marketing point of view. So now we've been asked another question, and I would like to ask if any of you have any comments before we get to that on the fact that what 5G requires is this blanketing of radiation. Professor Frank, you alluded to that in your article.
Well, I think this question about the American regulatory apparatus is exemplary of internationally common situation, which is that the regulatory apparatus has been captured by special interests. One of the signs of that is that the legal arrangements that used to be more decentralized, that used to allow local communities to make decisions about, say, the positioning of antennae for this sort of communication system, that those have been removed, those that allow local communities to make these decisions. And by centralizing it and then capturing the regulatory authority, the FCA, some of this is also happening in Britain. As I wrote in my article, when you find out in the Manchester Guardian that lawyers are being paid large amounts of money to fight out the rights to use lampposts with local authorities who want to charge extra because they're, as we say here, skint. Skint means in Scottish, broke under austerity. The local councils are desperate for a source of income. So they found out that the 5G antennae are ripe for putting on lampposts, but they want to get their share of the money. As soon as you know that lawyers are being used to fight over lampposts, you know something's up. And I think that the loss of control by local communities, this is much less true in Europe. Parts of Europe, local communities have stopped 5G rollout, many of them. But that's not good enough. You need to have a non-capture, a decapturing of national regulatory authorities so that they have teeth and are fair, we say unbiased, meaning that they look at the evidence scientifically without taking the vested interests into special account.
Well, that's and that's very, very well said. One question was, is anyone challenging this rule? And the answer is yes, and indeed. Children's Health Defense has filed a lawsuit on this issue, and I think that it's important for people to be aware that this is taking place, and we are certainly glad that they are doing that. It is, I'm tempted to paraphrase Mae West, so many problems, so little time. The reality is that among the many problems of the 5G that the Chinese have identified already is the fact that it consumes up to 4 times more energy than 4G. it consumes more energy. And in fact, in some Chinese cities, we have confirmed with our colleagues in China, where I am a visiting professor at Sichuan University, that they are turning off 5G at night to save energy. And that within China, as you know, is a different kind of government. So within the government, there's a very big struggle going on now because the telecom part of the government is saying, we need more money to pay for our energy demands. And the energy part of the government is saying, we can't afford it. So the good news is they're duking it out. But the bad news is that if 5G proceeds, it's an energy vampire. It's an energy hog, as I've written about in an op-ed that might be useful. Another question that we have has to deal with the environmental impacts of these antennas. And as Professor Miller said, we have actual studies that have been done on modeling the bodies of the honeybee. Now, the honeybee is one of 2,000 pollinating insects, critical to agriculture, absolutely essential for agriculture. Honeybees are endangered, so much so that over the past decade, trucks drive around with hives in them to provide honeybees for the functioning of fertilizing in crops that otherwise would not be able to succeed. There are many factors that have been identified that are endangering the honeybees, including neonicotinoid pesticides and other agents. But one of the things we can tell you from experiments done on the modeling of the body of the honeybee is that the 5G signals resonate fully with the body of the honeybee, and studies have shown that this will interfere with the ability of these bees to do their job, which is to fertilize crops. Not fertilize, I'm sorry, to pollinate crops. So it's really important to understand, without honeybees, we have no agriculture. In addition, the effects on trees has been shown with 3G and 4G through machine learning analyses conducted by Malka Halgamug and I and others, published in the journal Environmental Research, where we showed that the majority of these studies show effects on the ability of plants to grow. And so we're talking about introducing an even more widespread exposure to an agent that has been documented to be damaging to bees and plants. And as Professor Miller said, look, we all have the same DNA if we're alive. Living things have DNA. You move up the phylogenetic chain, we get more complicated, but the difference between a mouse and a human is very small, which is why we have established these protocols for studying them. One question has been asked about effects in Mexicali, eucalyptus, mesquites that are dying. And I don't know if any of you have any thoughts about this. I certainly wish I could answer these questions. Frankly, we are trying to work with colleagues who know more than we do about these issues, but we certainly are aware that this is a major problem, and there could be many explanations, including global warming, which does create changes in the environmental conditions. But another question I think we are better prepared to answer is this one. There have been significant increases in reports of cardiac issues and events in young, fit, healthy individuals, including stroke, eye strokes, and aneurysms, including atrial fibrillation in younger and younger people. Parkinson's disease is being diagnosed at younger ages. I've thought for the three of us might take a good look at age of diagnosis in different countries for these neurodegenerative diseases. There are also increases for insomnia, headaches, and tinnitus. Could this be related to the increased exposures to cell phone radiation?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think we know yet. It is indeed possible, and we need to keep these new events in mind and introduce, when we can, studies to find out. But at the moment, that's just a hypothesis, and without a hypothesis, you don't do a study. So that maybe some of us, maybe not me, I'm getting on, will study this.
Well, if any of you listening have a way to get to Michael J. Fox, who has Parkinson's and was diagnosed at a young age, I think that the leadership of someone actually like him would be very valuable to answer this question. It is a puzzle. We know from studies that have been done, case control designs, that Parkinson's is increased in those with exposure to pesticides. And that has been identified in a number of some studies. But again, this is a very good question. It needs to be answered. There's good biological reasons to think there could be a relationship. There are studies showing that cell phone radiation can disrupt cardiac rhythm, can affect heart rate variability, which is an important parameter. And it wouldn't be it's plausible to think there's an association, but as Professor Miller has said, we do not, unfortunately, have those studies underway. We have one additional question is it safer to use Wi-Fi than 4G LTE cellular in a handheld mobile device? Does either of you want to try to answer that? I'm happy to jump in. What I would say is this: the strength of the signal is what determines the safety of using a phone. And if you have fewer bars, your phone is smart. It's going to work harder. The harder it works, the more radiation it's putting out. The closer the device is held to you, the more the radiation gets into you. Most of the antennas of the phone are symmetrical, meaning that they are radiating in an equal area. They're not directional, meaning they could be radiating out. And so as a consequence, when the signal is weak, you don't use a phone unless it's really an emergency. And for information on that, and also for information on how to wire your computer and have a situation where you're not going to be exposed so much to radiation because you have a wired connection like the one that I have here for my computer, that information can be found on our website at ehtrust.org. And those of you who want to support what we're doing, please join our Patreon program, where you will get access to Professor Miller, Professor Frank, and myself for more detailed questions that we're happy to answer, and where you will be able to see transcripts of this event and other things that we will prepare uniquely for our Patreon members. We are a small organization. We have recently joined in legal efforts, which are Herculean, and we've recently been described as a David versus Goliath. But you know, in the David versus Goliath battle, we know who won. And we know that we may be small, but we may be more nimble, as Malcolm Gladwell pointed out in his wonderful book on this issue. Sometimes small is more able to get things done. And we're going to certainly find that out soon, because we do believe this is a huge public health threat. It's a global issue. And now I'd like to ask Professor Frank and Professor Miller if they have any concluding remarks they'd like to share with us.
Well, I'll just say that I think the public needs to understand that reliable information is not being provided to them, particularly by vested interests who stand to gain from the rolling out of these technologies, and that what intelligent citizens need to do is insist on arm's length regulatory arrangements. The governance of this sort of technology is inadequate in many parts of the world. And it's only by intelligent citizens speaking out and saying, this is not arm's length regulation based on science. It's only if you stand up and say that anything's going to change. So, many of us have just begun to do it. Some of the people on this panel have been doing it for decades. Please join us. Thank you.
Well, the only thing I'd like to say is to remind people that there are alternatives to cell phones. And the alternative is clearly the landline. And we need to persist using landlines. Now, landlines exist. They're everywhere. In addition, in some parts of the world, they have been replaced successfully with a fiber optic cable. My own phone, landline phone, and my computers are powered by Bell Fibe, which is fiber optic cable coming direct to the house. So we don't need Wi-Fi, and we can live very well without it. So look into alternatives. They may well be closer than you think. And thank you all very much for listening to us.
I'm deeply grateful to Professor Frank and to Professor Miller for taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you all, and stay well during these challenging times.